There's been a lot of debate lately about government debt. The deficit is big because of COVID, and that's a good thing. It showed government moved fast to protect us, and all that spending is good for economic recovery. But powerful forces want government to cut spending and eliminate the deficit as fast as possible. And they're using an old argument to support their case. They're saying that Canada had a debt crisis once before in the mid-1990s, and if we don't cut spending, we'll have another one soon. That claim has been repeated so often, it's usually reported as fact. The only problem is, it isn't true. Canada never had a debt crisis in the 1990s. Let's look at the actual history. The federal government ran deficits for many years in the 1980s and 1990s, not because government was spending more on actual programs for Canadians. There was no long-term change in that. The main problem was the state of the economy. We had had 3 bad recessions, one in the mid-1970s, one in the early 80s, and another one in the early 90s. And the main cause of those recessions was high interest rates. The government and the Bank of Canada were obsessed with getting inflation down from 10% to 5% and then to 2%. Higher interest rates meant slower growth and higher unemployment. It also meant the government paid way more interest on its own debt. In the early 1990s, for example, just before this so-called debt crisis, the government was paying almost 9% interest, but the economy was growing at 3%. That sets up an explosive situation where the debt is growing much faster than the economy. And that would happen even if Canadians paid enough in taxes to fully pay for all government programs. So it was high interest rates and the resulting recessions that caused the debt, not rampant spending. But even then, the debt was still not out of control. In 1995, when this imaginary crisis supposedly hit, Canada's gross federal debt was 78% of GDP. That was half as much as at the end of World War II, and not much different than average debts in other industrial countries. Then what happened? The government of the day, swayed by conservative arguments about austerity, imposed the deepest spending cuts in Canada's post-war history. Program spending fell by 30% relative to GDP over just a few years. The so-called debt crisis was just an excuse, and Canadians suffered deeply. The biggest cuts were in employment insurance, down $7 billion, health and social transfers to the provinces, down $6 billion, and other federal programs, down $6 billion. Those cuts deeply damaged Canadian society. They increased inequality, and we've been trying to recover ever since. Worst of all, they were completely unnecessary. Sure, the deficit fell quickly. In fact, it completely disappeared within just 2 years, by 1997. But was it spending cuts that solved the problem almost overnight? Not exactly. What happened was interest rates fell as the Bank of Canada eased off, and the economy started growing faster. Getting Canadians back to work, not cutting their programs and benefits, was the key. And that relationship between interest rates and growth changed even more as time went by. Look at the last few years before the pandemic. Interest rates were lower than economic growth. In that situation, the debt automatically shrinks. So the key to avoiding a debt crisis is not to slash spending, it's to keep interest rates low and keep the economy strong. That's why there's no looming debt crisis today, just like there was no debt crisis in 1995. Last year, even with the pandemic, Canada's gross federal debt was still modest, 57% of GDP. That's less than half as much as other industrial countries, and a quarter as high as Japan. There's no debt crisis in Japan. They spent just as much fighting COVID as Canada did, and there's no looming debt crisis in Canada either. In fact, this whole story that we had a debt crisis in the 90s is just a spooky bedtime fable. It simply isn't true. The real lesson of the 1990s is not to cut government spending or else face a crisis. The true lesson is, don't shoot yourself in the foot with high interest rates. Focus on creating jobs. Then we can easily pay for the public services Canadians need. I'm Jim Stanford, and this is Debunkers Academy.